Okay, thank you very much. I've just realised how much of what I was going to say Jane's already given you in that wonderful overview, introduction to the social what she calls the social investment approach. So what can I add? Well, I want to just revisit it a little to give my take on the social investment approach. Probably spend a bit more time on the inclusive growth and the development policy, and a bit more time exploring parallels, complementarities, differences between the social investment approach and the inclusive growth approach from development studies. And then, hopefully, that will open up new ways of thinking for us to quickly visit the Australian case to show how these new ways of thinking give us new insights, fresh insights on the role of social policy in contemporary economies. So I've had my interest in this is really quite long-standing. Basically a welfare state scholar who doesn't know anything about development policy, but driven in part by the influx of students from our region, from countries would never claim to have a welfare state, but are very actively interested in a lot of aspects of social policy back home. It's difficult not to begin to explore some of the boundaries between welfare states and social policy, which just used to be for those old advanced economies in Europe and America and Britain, and explore the boundaries between that and development studies. But it's all pretty new, but it's all happening very rapidly in the sort of as in the research areas, and the literature and the books on this keeps rolling. And there's that nice phrase from Thandika Makandaweri, who's been absolute leader, inspiration in a lot of this interdisciplinary dialogue, that I think he wrote last year, that the Chinese walls that used to obtain between social policy in the welfare states and development studies, they're well and truly coming to an end. And I've referred to the multipolar concept earlier this morning with Robert Zoellick was talking. And I think it's creating this most exciting scene for social policy exploration, whereas the economic development patterns change dramatically, throwing up new questions about social policy. It's why we've got to have this much more integrated approach. But it is very difficult, as we were talking last night with Martin at the dinner. Getting across those disciplinary boundaries, it's a bit scary. Economists are doing it bravely at the moment, but I'll demonstrate today how it can be a bit scary as soon as you start stepping outside your area of competence. So, as I say, a lot of parallels between what Jane presented and how I would present the social investment approach. Just a couple of variations on the historical context in the way the relationship between social and economic policy has been understood in welfare states. I do have a big emphasis in my own thinking about the way we understand the Keynesian period, the social policy in the Keynesian period. And it's important because, as we know these days, scholars are getting very interested in the 30s and 40s and lessons from that period. If markets became so disembedded as they did in the Great Depression, how did markets get re-embedded in society, and how was successful politics restored? So I think the big lesson from the Keynesian period has nothing to do with Beveridge and Bismarck. Especially, we know this in Australia because we never had a Beveridge and a Bismarck. We didn't get a welfare state in the 40s. How we re-embedded the market was through the macroeconomic policies thought through, given to us by John Maynard Keynes, so that once markets were once again delivering employment opportunities for citizens. This basically solved the social security problem, and thereafter welfare states were kind of an icing on the cake. So he called it a socialisation of investment. It's quite a nice little parallel here to our social investment approach. He called it a certain amount of socialisation of investment needed to stabilise the system. So the other variance with Jane was that it wasn't such a cosy relationship, I think, between social policy and economic policy in the welfare state period. Because once the welfare states grew in the 60s and 70s, the ideology of welfare changed. Welfare wasn't a nice complement to full employment, but as we know through the tradition from T.H. Marshall's thinking on social rights through to Esping Andersen and his typologies based on decommodification and destratification, it was very much a case of social policy turned in to be a case of politics against markets. Markets were the problem, social policy was the solution. And and that was kind of situation reverses in the 80s and 90s where social policy becomes the problem for the markets. So I think that really set up the great challenge of this last decade that Jane has just set out for us. That how could you get some reintegration of economic and social policy that had been lost through those decades. We had to unpack a lot of the assumptions of social policy about markets. They're not all bad, they're not all, so, and vice versa. I think in thinking through the neoliberalism, it wasn't a case of saying markets were, weren't important, but they weren't always the solution to be preferred over against the state. So how far have we come? I think exactly along the lines Jane set out. There has been, it's quite remarkable, every time I pick up a journal or visit the bookstore, there's a new book about the social investment approach or the social investment state, and it's grounded. Where it has become rooted in policy practices around the whole human capital agenda, as she described, from early years to labour market programs and so on. And even in comparative welfare state studies, we see people are adding in new criteria to comparing welfare states. We don't just compare them anymore on how good they are at protecting people from markets, but how good they are on the productive value that they add, especially through education, labour market programs and so on. There is a lot of, amongst the policy commentators, naturally you're going to have some people who were very sceptical about this social investment approach. It wasn't really a form of workfare, devaluing protection, devaluing compensation. We can cut pensions, we can cut benefits, we just want people to work and be productive. On the other hand, I think the agenda that's coming into its own, at least as in an ideal type form, is the progressive one that Jane was talking about. The more you get into investing in human capital, you can't be successful in raising education, numeracy, literacy. You can't be successful in skill improvement, as Esping Andersen set out so well in his account of the social investment state, without tackling all the wider determinants, social determinants of how people perform or of their health. So I think the latest elaborations, as it's gone from a big plus on investing in children, investing in unemployed people, I think a number of scholars have been saying you can really, if you take Paduan's talk this morning about the win-win situations, and you start to think through on a model of this, like the flexicurity approach in Europe. If you start to think through work-family balance, if you start to think through the economics of investing or not investing in long-term unemployed people, lifelong learning, it's not hard to come up with quite a package of win-win policies, social policies that also score in terms of the economy. Outstanding agenda, I think, before we leave the social investment approach, I think from the beginning, a lot of people thought, well, isn't it a bit too instrumentally, about it's all about the economy. Are we only investing in children, little kiddies, as Ruth Lister asked, because one day they're going to be productive workers? Shouldn't we be investing them in just for their lives as children? And in our own university here, Simon Biggs has talked about the poverty of meaning, about retirement and ageing. So social investment can't all be just about making people productive in the economy, but there are silences there about the other spheres of life. Finally, the one that's really set people back, Reza we had an email overnight from someone offering an abstract for the book that's going to be forthcoming from this conference. It's about the social investment approach. I noticed the last line was, well, but in Europe at the moment, with the public sector and the deficits the way they are, really we need a lot more other things to be happening as well as just investing in human capital, and if it's going to be a durable model. Okay, so as I said, that's the bit I do know a fair bit about. I'm quite confident of what I just said, but in the interest of the purpose of our symposium, so that let's start thinking, let's try and connect with those development people. Here's my little take from my superficial knowledge of the parallel histories, the converging histories, why the two ways of thinking are coming together. So we see, I just mentioned, you can see the Keynesian period, the post-Second World War model of development, a kind of a welfare state parallel, the redistribution issues that emerged. Then there was the reaction, Washington Consensus, and now inclusive growth is that's the counterpart to the social investment approach phase in welfare states. Now, I think that probably didn't come out very strongly this morning, as much as what I expected from the development scholar people. For Jane and myself, I think we see the social investment approach as quite a break from the old welfare state model, and it's fairly clearly defined. This morning, I think I probably expected to hear more about a break with sort of neoliberal models, but then this probably just shows my ignorance. But I did pick up on a lot of the main themes about nowadays we are being much more pragmatic about the state and the market, and a lot more we heard about national champions and industry policies, so a lot more things seem to be back on the table, which was what I thought. But as Reza, I think, was making the point very persuasively, it's all very, it sounds to me like there's no real theoretical substance to it much. It's not like there's a new general theory replacing neoliberalism, but there's a big agreement. People have got to be a lot more pragmatic and practical about what works and evaluate them, as Martin reminded us. So, what have I taken to be some of the new policy settings? Under-theorised, okay, but there are definitely a new group of policy settings which seem to distinguish the inclusive growth approach. And we've heard these. I think I was pretty confirmed from the sessions this morning that these aren't bad. Inclusion and growth can't be separated. Martin said you don't have growth and then tackle the poverty after. Tackling the poverty now, whether it's through nutrition or whether it's human capital spending, it's got to go in the beginning. We don't have a trickle-down approach in inclusive growth. But what for us, for people with no experience of development studies, what really strikes me is the way these people have a much more focus on the economy as a whole, right? If there's too much, if it's too big a gap between the urban and the rural, you need to take action. You've got to manage your pattern of economic growth so you can smooth this out into a smoother pattern of development. So that's something that stands out as really different to the way we're thought in welfare states. Big emphasis there that if we're going to have a durable welfare social policy regimes, they've got to be based on productive employment, getting people into jobs in the market, as Jane just said. And we can't just have a tax transfer kind of welfare system that comes along after the economic event. And so the other very striking theme is the need to manage equality of opportunity. And Jennifer was talking about services, and I think there's many documents have this theme: the need for universal services, so that all individuals, all citizens across the economy can have their opportunity to become engaged. Again, those themes about pragmatism, the RESA themes at the bottom of the slide. Okay, I'll just have to keep moving, so I'll just jump across summarising what I said about how I understand the inclusive growth, to make a few comparisons and contrasts. First contrast. What stands out to me is the social investment approach. It began with people in the welfare sector, in the social policy sector, dealing with health and education, facing like neoliberal privatisations and cutbacks and shrinking of the state. They got together and they thought we've got to recover some economic rationale for social service spending, right? And so I think it was all about social policy looking for an economic argument to take to Treasury, Robert. Whereas inclusive growth is quite different, as Ariza again talked about in his Beijing consensus. It's more about the economy or the model of economic development needing a welfare or a social rationale. So hence the need for new measures of how do we know we're there and so forth. So I think that stands out. One's a critique of economic development from within. The other one is for welfare seeking an economic rationale. Social investment state arguments also, I think this is a big important contrast, have been very much about how do we equip the individual to get into the economy. Hence the focus on human capital spending. We'll just educate them up, give them lifelong learning, and then we'll get them into the economy and off they go. Whereas the inclusive growth approach is much more about looking at the economy as I say, is it equipped for individuals? Is the economy as it is a kind of is it of a kind that is presenting economic opportunity across your population? So reinforcing that the social investment is pretty silent on the pattern of growth. This was third way. Anthony Giddens will have the neoliberal market, but will assist people to participate in it. Whereas inclusive growth is much stronger on the actual pattern of development itself and requiring an evening out of development. Beyond that, I think there's huge agreement, resounding agreement on the employment-centred welfare rather than tax transfers alone. Huge agreement on the human capital value. I think inclusive growth has a much stronger emphasis that we heard from, again, Martin this morning about, not all inequalities are good. Some are, but they can be bad inequalities. All right, so how are we going? Oh, 5 minutes. All that practice during the week. It's paying off. Okay. So that's the take on the social investment approach, and then my comparison with the inclusive growth paradigm, if it's going to be called that, or ideal type. How does it help? Does it help us at all? Does it change anything? when we revisit our national case study, in this case Australia, when we bring it back home? Is it giving us any differences of perspective? Now, a lot of this thinking here was based on the roundtable I mentioned this morning, where we had an inclusive growth in Australia roundtable. So I'm just throwing some information here, drawn from very reputable scholars, but it's not information that I'd answer for a claim to have developed myself or even fully understand. So, especially when it comes to measures of income equality and income inequality, Alison, we can soon have very complex debates, as it all depends whether it's absolute or relative and what's been measured. We heard that this morning. But let's just have a basic scenario here of Australia. Have we got an inclusive growth or inequality problem here? Let's see. Things certainly have changed since the post-war period. Post-war period in Australia, a bit of a golden age like many other countries, probably America included. Broad-based manufacturing, good jobs for working class people. It was the most equal, egalitarian period, I think we could say, following Andrew Leigh in our history. Then, like many another country, from the 1980s, globalisation, rising inequality. But we did, a feature of the Australian system that's worth mentioning, in that early period, 80s through to the mid-90s, we did have very active tax transfer policy action and innovation, and it was significantly offset the rising market inequality, which was, I think people would say, was a bit of a feature of our transition into that globalisation period. Nevertheless, look at it now. If Pat Owen was here, I think he showed us on the board. He showed us we were the red bar on the inequality measures in the OECD this morning, and if you count it up, we'd be 10th from the bottom out of 29 performers. Right, we're running out of time. Okay. So, and the big contributor to a lot of the increase is very much the top, decile, the big top end increases. So, if you go around the people, if you get a sense of Australia today, they'll say, well, we're not like the US, although Martin said last night we are, but at least we believe we're not as bad as the US, but clearly we're on the wrong trajectory. Now, so that's very much an income inequality approach. But at our round table, a much more interesting presentation, I thought, was by John Buchanan. Now, this evokes more the inclusive growth framework of, do we have an even pattern of growth? So his big emphasis was on what's happening in employment and the kind of employment, the kind of jobs we've got. So as you can see there, wage shares have dropped 10% across that period. We have very flexible labour markets, as 20% casual, high underemployment. But he kept coming back to our employment portfolio problem. I mentioned the post-war period, a big manufacturing boom, a lot of good jobs, more and better jobs, right? With the economy today, quite strong, but it's based in mining. A big part of that is mining, but doesn't deliver many jobs. So his portfolio, we haven't got figures time here, but if you get a big growth in low pay service jobs, low skill service jobs, not returning much in terms of wage and so on, have you got the portfolio of even development, even growth that can support an egalitarian economic model? And it's highlighted for us with the two-speed economy that we're all very aware of in Australia today. So skip over the history. I want to come now to the last two slides, right? Time up. Okay, so I was saying, what if we're trying to think through Australian social policy today? Does social investment offer much? And in the next slide, I'll say, does inclusive growth framework, does that add any value? So it certainly does. Like, I think and this is where we're not being fictional. I think that I mentioned earlier on that the human capital agenda has hit the ground in many countries, and certainly in Australia we have a big national, they call it COAG, human capital agenda, which has been a feature of social policy in the first decade of this century. If we looked across that flexicurity model I talked about, the win-win, we'd have a long way to go. Income support for unemployed people, shocking. Labour market programs, half-baked. And work-life balance, we're getting there, but a long way to go. Finally, I think we would say, well, that's where we'd be putting our effort around the social infrastructure of growth, the flexicurity, but we shouldn't be doing that at the expense of the more traditional protective role of the state. Finally, inclusive growth, what does it offer? Well, that's where I think, if I'd done my Australian history bit, Australian policy makers have always been far more interested in delivering good jobs as the employment-centred approach to welfare than they have been interested in welfare states. So I haven't got the answers to all this, but if looking at an inclusive growth lens, I'd say with John Buchanan, well, we've got to be at least concerned about our employment portfolio. Are we going to have the more and better jobs from the private sector that will be needed? And this is where I think that because of the neoliberal economic period, we've long given up on stock Australian policy interest in industry policy, innovation policy, government provision of infrastructure. Maybe we should be revisiting some of that. Finally, let's learn from the inclusive growth the need to address bad inequalities of place and population groups as a matter of economic importance as much as social. And as other people have said, you can't do all that without new models of governance which are effective. Thank you very much, Reza.